Hello, I'm Danny Lee. I'm joined by Alexander Philippe, the director of 7852, a forensic analysis of the shower scene in Psycho, which I think we can call the most revolutionary and the most influential sequence in cinema history. Can we say that?
I think we can say that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it changed everything. You know, it changed cinema, it changed culture, it changed the way that we watch movies. It's really sort of, I think, impossible to comprehend what cinema would be like without the movie, but specifically without that scene. So it's an amazing moment. Yeah.
I need to ask when your first exposure came to Psycho, and whether it was a film that you were prepared for. I mean, Psycho is obviously a film with a huge reputation. Right. Were you aware of the reputation before you first saw it?
So I was exposed to Hitchcock very early. I mean, I'm talking like 5-6 years old. I was already watching his films.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, my dad was watching Hitchcock movies. He was watching Columbo. He was watching Starsky and Hutch. Those were the things that I remember were sort of constantly around. So as a result of that, very strangely, I don't really have a first memory of a Hitchcock film. I mean, there were certain movies that traumatized me as a kid. I will always remember walking in on my parents watching Eyes Without a Face.
Wow, okay.
At about 3. I was about 3 years old.
That would stay with you.
And it took me, 25 years to, when I was reintroduced to Eyes Without a Face and watched the movie, and then those images came rushing back, and I was like, oh my God, okay. That's the film, Scanners, Night of the Living Dead. I was watching those movies very, very young. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've always been sort of really interested in horror. My parents were totally fine with me watching horror films. But strangely, and I don't know if it's because of the fact that they were always kind of around. Mm-hmm. I don't have that first memory of Psycho, of Vertigo, of North by Northwest, any of his movies.
So that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And I wonder in that case whether, in terms of your relationship with the film, whether it's about the shower scene and the kind of the significance and the the symbolism of that scene in particular, rather than the film itself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, look, I really like to look at details, and I'm not interested in sort of making a general film or a general statement about Hitchcock, because what does that mean, Sure. So I think when you're looking at this kind of extraordinary artist, which he obviously was, the focusing on a detail like this, I think, is a way to really dig, I think, deeper and get closer to the kind of person and artist that he was. And I mean, I think the shower scene specifically, when you're talking about an artist, a film artist who was after the ultimate sort of cinematic trick, I mean, I think you can absolutely make the argument that what he did with the shower scene is something that he had been after his entire life. This is someone who was after creating emotion, and I'm talking heightened emotion, so the shower scene is his ultimate, his greatest cinematic trick. So as a result of that, you're seeing so much of Hitchcock in those 2 minutes, because he worked so hard to get there.
It's one of the things you bring out very clearly, I think, in the film, is that sense of, it's a starting point, the shower scene, but it's also something with a history, and it's Hitchcock's history in particular. So you have Blackmail, you have The Lodger, you have Rear Window, and you suddenly, it's interesting, even for people who I think are familiar with those films, you suddenly think, oh, of course, suddenly everything becomes, well, not everything becomes apparent, because that's the magic of Psycho, is there was something else was going on as well, but you do see that these were obviously, the themes behind the shower scene, and also that whole sense of physically of the water, the pouring water, the shower curtain, all of that was stuff that he'd been playing with for quite some time.
Yeah, and it's not just motifs. I mean, I think there's a dialogue that happens, I think, between his movies. I feel the more I study Hitchcock, which is something I've done now for a long time, and I plan to continue on doing for a long time, is I think his movies obviously are absolutely fascinating by themselves, but you look at his body of work, and I think what he's left us is this grand sort of chess game that we're still trying to connect the dots, still trying to figure out, to put the pieces together. For me, Hitchcock is very much the equivalent of Nabokov in literature. I mean, you look at a book like Pale Fire, where scholars are still trying to understand what he's doing with this, and the deeper you go, the more you find, and the resonance of some of these images. I mean, you were talking about what he's doing with previous movies. I mean, you look at Rear Window, this amazing scene where they're watching him, cleaning the bathroom walls, and it's so amazing to hear, them just sort of talking about it. It's almost like he's setting you up 6 years earlier for this thing that he's going to do 6 years later.
Right.
It's crazy.
It's all very deliberate, isn't it? It's so fascinating. And Psycho, which is, I suppose, one of the fascinations of the film as a whole, is it was seen at the time as it was potentially very trashy. It was seen as this ghost train ride, essentially. And in fact, what you have is this movie, which I think when film lovers now try and hold up the whole medium of film and say this is as valid as ballet or opera or any other kind of high art form, Psycho is the film they go to.
Well, this is the thing that's amazing too, is thinking about Psycho in the context of where it came in, in terms of Hitchcock's life and career. Right. He was 61 years old.
Right.
He had just done North by Northwest, which is this grand sort of Technicolor, major movie stars, wonderful chase movie, super entertaining. But, he was also this very respected filmmaker. He had nothing to prove at that point. And yet he clearly felt that it was probably time for him to reinvent himself. It's astonishing to think about the risk that this represented, I think, for him as an artist. To do this, to take this pulp fiction piece that everybody was telling him, don't do it, it's beneath you. And not only does he do it, but he doubles down and he basically finances most of the movie himself. And then he takes 7 days to shoot this one scene. I really can't put into words sort of the major gamble that this was for him at the time. I think he had a lot to lose, but I think he saw that. He saw it. I think he pictured it. And I held in my hands. There's this amazing piece of paper at the Margaret Herrick Library in Los Angeles, where they have a lot of Psycho, original sort of materials from the production and pre-production and all that. And there's this this yellow piece of paper, and it's an early draft of kind of a sequence, very rough sequencing by Hitchcock, by his hand, in ink. And you see the sequences numbered, and at the bottom of the page, it says "The Murder" in all caps. And that's all it was at that point, because he told Truffaut, he said that is the one thing, that's the one reason he wanted to make Psycho, is the murder in the bathtub coming out of the blue. That was it.
See, that's so fascinating, because Hitchcock was obviously, he was always obsessed from the earliest point with what happens when you put one image after an image and you build those up and you create something different. And that's Psycho is this astonishing story, an astonishing narrative, but also it has this thing which is purely imagistic in the middle. It's just pictures, moving pictures, and it's the greatest director of all time, I suppose, making his, well, I suppose Psycho it's the high watermark, isn't it? I mean, after that, The Birds is a fantastic movie. He went on to make great films, but Psycho is sort of, you're right, it's where it was all leading to, really.
Yeah, I think that's Psycho, but I think specifically the shower scene.
Right.
What's remarkable too is if you think about it, the shower scene really is the climax of the piece. There is no higher point in it. So you can, if you want to really nitpick at it, you can say, well, the second half of Psycho is not as great as the first. I will agree with that, but I will also say I don't think it could have been, because you've reached your climax. You can't possibly top that. And so the risk, once again, in terms of pure storytelling, that it took for him to say, we're going to have the climax of the piece and it's going to work. 40 minutes into it it's pretty ballsy. Yeah.
I mean, there's a moment in the film where Hitchcock's referred to as being potentially angry with actors, and I think that's very interesting, isn't it? Because, when you look at the first act of the movie, and you're right, I mean, the movie, you could read the movie as just ending with Janet Leigh's death. Janet Leigh, as you talk about in the film, huge movie star at that point, and the majority of people going to see the film will have been going because it was Hitchcock obviously had gravitas and Hitchcock had standing, but Janet Leigh was also the movie star, so you went on a Friday night to see Janet Leigh. Right. Hitchcock was obviously very careful about making sure that people didn't talk about, or at least he encouraged people not to talk about what happened. Right. So you're going to have audiences continually coming to see the movie star, who then, and it's something which even to this day, I mean, movies, it's the cardinal rule: you don't kill the star.
You don't, of course.
You don't kill the star, and you particularly don't kill the star that early into the movie.
Yeah. No, I mean it was a complete first, and it's also remarkable. I mean, I think one thing we don't talk about enough with Psycho specifically is how well developed those characters are.
Yeah.
And I mean, Marion Crane, she is so relatable. I mean, it's very much sort of fundamentally a movie about sad souls, sad, lonely souls. And I'm talking both about, here Marion and Norman, who I think you could also argue are they're doppelgangers of each other. I mean, Norman is the dark mirror that she looks into, But she essentially makes a decision to steal that money to be with the man that she loves, which is something that people can relate to. Mm-hmm. And then she makes a second strong choice, which is, when it's starting to rain, she's going to stop at this motel by herself, which is, not the kind of stuff that, women were doing back in the day. You just wouldn't do that. And then she makes another extraordinary decision, which is, she sees in Norman this thing that she could become. She sees clearly that he's gone down a wrong path. She doesn't want to do that. She's making the decision to return to Phoenix, return the money, and face the consequences. I mean, all the way through, she is an amazingly strong, protagonist and somebody who makes decisions that, sure, she makes she makes a mistake. But she's still likable. She's still relatable because she's human. And she pays the price.
It's fascinating because in the film, I mean, you obviously devote a certain amount of time to the shower scene and to the mechanics of the shower scene and the psychology of the shower scene, but you also include the parlour scene, which is what comes directly before, because it actually seems, when people talk about the shower scene, it's part of that whole sequence, and you can't kind of have one without the other. You can't have the shower scene without that parlour scene, which is so different in terms of tone, so different in terms of the entire thing. It's much slower, it's much more gentle, but then...
Oh, yeah, I mean... Gosh, we could talk about the parlor scene, just that, for hours, because I mean, if we want to look at sort of the shower scene as possibly the most important scene in the history of movies, and I think I will make that statement, okay? I think in terms of like the greatest scenes of all time, the parlor scene is just right there. But I'm thinking about, the dynamic between these characters and what's going on. I mean, you could study every line and the delivery of every line and all the subtext, the pauses, the very subtle sort of moments that happen between those two characters. It's an extraordinary scene, and the directing of it too. I mean, the way that Hitchcock composes his shots as Norman sort of changes his demeanor throughout that scene as well. It's extraordinary filmmaking, and you're right. I mean, I think that there is no real sort of resonance to the shower scene without that parlor scene that comes before. And then, of course, all this sort of extraordinary moment of pure cinema from the moment that she leaves the office, and then Norman observing, and then going to the house, and it's oh man, it's so good.
I mean, I was going to ask actually whether you think part of the reason that scene is, certainly at the time when people didn't know what on earth was coming. I mean, unsettling doesn't even cover how it must have felt. But even now, no matter how many times you've watched the film, it's still unsettling. And I wonder whether that feeling of being unsettled, if it really starts with Norman looking through the hole, because at that point, surely that's on some level Hitchcock saying, "Well, look, this is you too."
Yeah, so there's so much going on here. I mean, there's first of all this point of view shift that really literally when she leaves the office, you're no longer with her now, you're with him. So that's one thing that's going on. But the thing that's amazing to me is what happens the moment that she steps into the bathroom, because there's something so extraordinarily mundane, right? And you're watching it in real time. She puts the paper in, the pieces of paper in the toilet. She flushes the toilet. She takes off her robe. She steps into the shower. She opens the soap. She starts, showering, turns on the water. And I think if you're a moviegoer, that's not the kind of stuff you're supposed to be watching. Right. It's just too mundane. It's not. I mean, it's literally wasted screen time, right?
Sure.
But what it is, it's a more refined form of suspense. It's not the typical sort of bomb under the table that you know is going to go off at that point. It's more like something isn't right. I'm not supposed to be watching this. What is going on here? And I think in the back of your neck there somewhere that something wrong is going to happen.
Sure.
It's amazing what he does there.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? Because one of the kind of cliches about script writing and filmmaking is that, you come in to any scene, you come in at the last possible moment and you get out.
That's right.
You get out as quick as possible.
That's right.
And the shower scene turns that whole thing upside down, because when you actually stretch it out, you think, well, there's all this stuff happening before.
Yep.
And there's and after,
all the stuff after, the cleanup,
and it's the cleanup, and it's the cleanup, which is, I mean, the whole thing endures clearly, but the cleanup, that wouldn't, the scene, I don't think, would have the same, same impact if Hitchcock cut away a second earlier. It has to play out that way. But you're just completely tearing up all these rules of filmmaking. There are scriptwriters now being taught to come in late, get out early.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and that's I mean, every possible rule, I think, is broken. Not only every possible rule, but every possible taboo.
Sure.
I mean, it's and I think those are the reasons why this scene is so still resonant today. I mean, it's a kind of a punk rock kind of scene. Sure. But there's one thing that I want to mention too that I think is really fascinating to me, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Is what happens when you experience the murder itself. Because if you think about it, and if you look at all the different shots, which happen very, very, very fast, I mean, you have to sort of submit yourself to that, right? But there are moments when you experience the shots from the perspective of Marion, so you're the victim. Moments when you experience it from Mother, so you're the murderer. You're the voyeur. You're the spectator. You are the eye of God. And I think you could also argue there are moments when you're Hitchcock as the God of the piece.
Sure.
What he's doing to you right there is that he is fragmenting your personality. He is splitting you into these 6 different sort of personas at the same time.
Right.
And so what he's doing is he is turning you into the psycho while you're watching it.
Right.
It's extraordinary. And you have no way out. When you experience the scene, when it sort of washes over you, you are all these people at once. And I think the sense of disorientation is so tremendous that when you think about people watching that movie back in 1960, it was literally like experiencing a new medium altogether. I can't even imagine what it was like.
Because we're sitting here now in the 21st century, and actually, the study of film is something that people do, and everybody, you don't even need to be a particular film buff to accept that. Of course, with any Hitchcock movie, there's any number of layers of stuff going on, and you can unpick it. 1960, I don't think people really thought about it in that way at all.
No.
I mean, Hitchcock, some people within the industry would be aware, an editor would be aware of mechanically what was going on, but people didn't think of all this stuff going on in the back of someone like Hitchcock's mind.
Yeah, well, and also to think about what it took to have the vision to edit this scene in this particular way. I recently did a Q&A for 7052 with Walter Murch in Ghent, sure. Which was great because I finally got a chance to show him the film, and he's so wonderful, obviously, and he was really focusing during the Q&A on Tomasini. And on what he calls those, cement splices that really at the time you pretty much had to commit to a cut.
Sure.
And if you think that Tomasini at the time and Hitchcock, didn't have the Bernard Herrmann music because Hitchcock didn't want to have music in the scene. What this means is that George Tomasini had to envision that cut before putting it together. And how in the world do you do that? Because, literally, some of these shots are so precise that if you add one frame or you take one frame out, it's just not the same.
Absolutely so.
So to not only envision it, but then to put it together and to have the courage to say, I'm going to commit to those cement splices all the way through, and then Hitchcock, of course, adds eventually the music because Bernard Herrmann said, I have an idea, and then gets it past the censors, and nothing changes. It's nothing short of a miracle that we have that scene the way that it is, still today.
And something you bring out in the film very clearly is that this is, I mean, people now are used to digital filmmaking and everything is done with the push of a button, and you can achieve perhaps nothing quite as great as the Psycho shower scene, but you can achieve great things with editing, without it becoming like a manual task. Whereas obviously, you draw out that comparison between the shower scene, the wielding of the knife, and the fact that this was a physical process with physical film, and as you say, you have to be so precise, and and editing is. You can look at it as an act of violence in some ways. You are cutting the film. You're cutting the film.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, that's the beauty of it. I mean, if you just looking at sort of all the different layers, of that scene itself, and the physical act. I mean, it's extraordinary.
So I wonder. I mean, you spoke about not quite remembering because you were probably exposed maybe a little too early we could say that to Hitchcock generally.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So you spoke about your memory of Psycho being kind of lost a little bit in the midst of time. But I wonder, with the shower scene, when you did then come to the decision of actually, I suppose first realising quite how significant it was for film, and then actually thinking, the next step maybe becomes making a film about this and how that process starts.
So the way that it works, and it's funny because I feel like this is our fourth feature at Exhibited Pictures, and there's a strange way that we sort of work. Those ideas, like People vs. George Lucas, like Duck of the Dead, like the Paul the Psychic Octopus, they just sort of. They come or they're around. I sort of keep them stored somewhere, and Carrie, my producer, and I, we obviously we talk a lot. We have this whole sort of bank of ideas, and there's usually a couple that tend to rise to the surface, and usually there's a point where I'm going to start bugging Carrie about something and say, look, I this one keeps coming back. I really, 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 really want to do this. And I think she knows that that's the moment when it's probably time to start sort of putting together a proposal and really sort of committing. So in this case, again, I don't really have that first memory of like committing to it. What I can tell you is that about 5 years ago, I know that I was getting serious about it. We put together a proposal, but then we were working on Duck of the Dead, so we had to kind of put the proposal aside for a couple of years, and then when Duck of the Dead was actually released, that's the first one I went back to, and then we instantly sort of went there, and it's been about a 3-year process to make this film. Yeah.
So is one of the early steps in putting the film together rewatching, and I'm guessing maybe a little obsessively, watching and rewatching the scene itself to actually to decide, I suppose, what kind of film you need to make off the back of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably say that I was watching the scene on average 20 times a day. Okay.
That's a little unnerving.
Which, I mean, there are really moments when you need to step away. It's such an intense scene. I had to step away from the intensity. But again, just the way I work personally, stylistically or sort of structurally, things come very, very quickly. Like I instantly sort of imagined this world where the people that we were interviewing, I wanted 7052 to be a film about people watching Psycho, and we're watching them as they're watching Psycho, and they're also watching us.
Sure.
So in order for this to happen, we had to sort of, create this illusion that they were there, at the Bates Motel and the Bates property. But I also wanted the structure of 1752 to mirror the structure of Psycho, in the sense that, if you're watching 1752, unless you haven't read anything about it, you know that you're watching a film about the shower scene. So the expectation walking into the theater or putting on your DVD or Blu-ray is that you're going to be experiencing or watching the shower scene at some point. That's the promise of the film, right? So the first 40 minutes or so, 7052, are about sort of creating that expectation and therefore teasing you about the scene, but also really sort of rooting that scene within its sort of historical, social, cultural context so that it can have greater resonance afterwards. And roughly 40 minutes into 1752, just as in Psycho, you get into the scene.
Sure.
So that was the general intent.
You bring in quite a few women's voices into the film, and I wonder if you found, I mean, I suppose thinking about the film, thinking about Psycho before you made the film, and certainly when you were putting together 7852, I wonder whether it felt like maybe sometimes men and women see that sequence in particular slightly differently.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would say very differently, and that's what's so amazing about again the scene, and so tricky about this scene, because it's a very questionable scene. I often talk about the shower scene as being this sort of Pandora's box that unleashed all these things on the world, and by that I mean, on the one hand, you have it broke taboos, and it changed I think perception in terms of what movies could do in terms of storytelling as well. It brought upon a new kind of film editing, a new way to sort of look, watch movies, but it also, I think, gave quote unquote permission to filmmakers to start doing things now that they probably thought was not possible back then. I think as a result of Psycho, as a direct result of Psycho, filmmakers wanted to raise the stakes. Mm-hmm. So where do you go from there? Well, you start getting more and more graphic. And I think that, now you're getting into the whole wave of, slasher films, the trend of, vulnerable, naked women getting, just violated, really, to use no other word, in safe spaces. And movies getting more and more bloody and more gruesome and more, sexist. So that's also very, very questionable, So I think the legacy of Psycho and the legacy of the shower scene has to be looked at, I think, from both perspectives. We can't just sort of say, it's extraordinary, which it is. And I think even all the women filmmakers that I interviewed, Ileana Douglas and Karen Kusama, obviously Marley, who also was the body double. I think they have great reverence for it, but I think they also realize how messed up that scene really is.
Well, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because obviously people look at Psycho as being one of the things that it did was it did eventually give rise to the slasher genre.
Yeah.
But it's a film in a scene in which there's no real violence. If you actually look for the moment that the knife, goes into skin, that's not there. That's not there. Everything is suggested.
Yeah, and that's the trick, of course, of the shower scene is in sort of everything that's emitted, and the fact that your brain goes there. You start sort of connecting the dots and seeing things that don't exist. But it's so restrained in that way. I think on the one hand, you look at the scene and it's a very sort of, it's so self-indulgent. It's so expressionistic. It's so over the top. And the fact that he took 7 days to do it, it's, it's so over the top. And yet, because you don't see anything, it is so controlled and restrained and elegant at the same time. And I think that's a lesson that I think filmmakers today, can still learn from Hitchcock and from Tomasini, because I think we reached a point in horror cinema where movies have become so kind of gross and over the top that how much further can you go? How much grosser can you get? What encourages me actually is is you're looking at some of the movies that have come out in recent years, and I think they are much more restrained now. A movie I really like is The Witch, where I think it's one of those movies that you have these moments where you're expecting this bloodbath, you're expecting this sort of typical gruesome scene, and he gives you the exact opposite, but it's so much more chilling. That way.
That's very Hitchcockian, isn't it?
It's very Hitchcockian, yeah. And I think that we're starting to see more elegant, horror films now. I think there's a new wave of horror filmmakers, and I'm not saying that I'm against gore. I love a great gory film, especially comedic, like Brain Dead. Peter Jackson, it's so fantastic, So I think there's so many different kinds of horror films, but I think that I think that it's great to see that filmmakers, I think today, are still learning from the master, from Hitchcock.
And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because Hitchcock, I mean, he says, at least, I wonder if it's quite that simple, but he says in your film that the reason Psycho is in black and white is specifically because otherwise there would be too much blood and it would be so repulsive to an audience. And you think it's interesting, isn't it? You fast forward a few years and the screens are filled with blood, and very red blood it is as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think he also really knew that shooting that film in color, I mean, there was no way that would have gone past the censors.
Sure.
I mean, he was already going so far. I mean, you have to think about also all the taboos that were broken. This is the first toilet flushing in the history of movies. This is the first belly button.
Yeah.
In the history of movies, this is the first time that you're seeing a major movie star in her underwear laying horizontally on a bed. All of those things were completely groundbreaking at the time. So I think the amount of blood, that amount of blood in color, I mean, especially when you read the memos from the Hayes office prior to the production of the shower scene, it's an astonishing memo to read, because he was basically told in so many words, based on the script, we're not going to accept this. This is just not going to fly.
Right.
It's completely objectionable. And not only does he do it, but somehow he manages to to make it pass without a single change, without a single alteration. I mean, to this day, I don't think anybody knows, really. Not even his family. They don't even know how he managed to do this.
See, that's genius.
Oh yeah,
that's the genius.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. My theory is that obviously, I mean, just looking at Hitch and his sort of presence, I mean, he was so sharp. He had such a sense of humor. He had such a way of sort of talking to people. I think he really charmed them.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, he told them, look, he didn't see those things that you thought you saw.
Think you saw.
You think you saw them.
I didn't show them. And he was being honest.
That's right. That's exactly it. And when you think about the toilet flushing, which I think is such a wonderful moment. It's such like a middle finger to the censors in a way. But I mean, he probably told them, look, she had to get rid of the clue. We have to show it. So right there, it's a sort of a key plot point. You have to show it. So, yeah.
I mean, one of the things you bring out in the film very clearly, as well as where the film sits for Hitchcock in his career,
right.
And what's happening sort of cinematically, you also talk about culture at large and what's happening in the world. I mean, it's a very interesting moment. The very end of the 50s, going into the 60s. I mean, I think the film is talked about as it's the first 60s film in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what's so remarkable about that movie and that scene specifically is that you get the feeling that it rips the curtain open on sort of the reality of a new world.
Sure.
And I think that as Marco Calavita, who's one of the experts in the film, talks about, there was something in the air. I mean, I don't want to give it away, obviously, but there were certain movies, there was a certain sort of kind of sexuality that was already showing up in certain movies at the time. And I think there was a sense clearly in society that the bubble of the 50s was a thing of the past. But I don't think people were ready to admit that to themselves just yet.
Sure.
And so Hitchcock shows up, and Mother shows up, and she rips open the curtain. And I think that was the announcement. You are no longer safe.
This is
exactly. The 50s, that bubble has just popped, and I just popped it for you. And now, you're alone.
Yeah.
It's a different world.
Because it's that single moment, isn't it, where you suddenly realise that, the American 50s, that whole post-war period, which is, it's the white picket fence and all the rest of it. And Psycho is what kicks down the white picket fence.
Completely.
Suddenly that whole era is just, and you realise symbolically where it comes in 1960.
Right.
It's Psycho is the line.
Yeah, and that's why, we when you look at that scene once again, it's not just what it did in terms of, storytelling or in terms of new techniques in movie making, but it's the time that it came. and all of that. I think all of those elements, and also the time in Hitchcock's career, and the fact that, quite frankly, only Hitchcock could have gotten away with it. You know, I mean, Michael Powell certainly didn't get away with Peeping Tom
right
at the same time.
Right.
You know, so all of those elements make that scene so crucial, because it is a crucial moment in filmmaking, but it's also a crucial moment in history and in culture, and really also, I think, a crucial moment in terms of how we watch movies. It really changed everything. And like I said, I think that if you remove Psycho from history, I mean, if somehow Bernard Herrmann had not told Hitch, I have this idea, and Hitch had decided to cut it down to an hour and make it a part of his TV show, I think we would be watching very different kinds of films today. And I think you could probably argue that as a result of that, culture would be different. I think it'd be a different kind of world. It's a weird thing to think about, but I think it's that important, you know.
From what you know of Hitchcock, I mean, do you think that he knew that he'd kind of achieved what he set out? Presumably, we assume that he set out to achieve, because it feels like for cinema, for the world, and for Hitchcock personally as well, there was before Psycho and there was after. I mean, do you think that he knew when he walked off set, or certainly when he walked out of the edit room, okay, this is it?
I don't think so. I think he knew after the release. From my understanding is that he was actually fairly sort of taken aback by the public reaction. I mean, that, you know, that his gamble sort of paid off to that extent, to that level. I don't think he saw that coming. I think he certainly aimed for it, and I think that, again, I will always go back to this idea that he took 7 days to shoot this scene. Not 6 days, not 5 days, not 4 days, which was probably enough. He felt he needed 7 days. I mean, that's what I always sort of go back to. That's what I always look at. Why 7 days?
It's a bit biblical.
It's a bit biblical, isn't it? I was just going to say, it's crazy, right? But it tells you that somehow he felt that those 78 setups were needed, right? And so you know, there's that sense that he took this massive gamble, that he knew that he needed to do something really, really special there, and the only reason that I can think of is that you know, he envisioned a public reaction to that scene, unlike anything that he had done before. I think that was it, you know. But at the end of the day, as an artist, that, you know, any artist taking a gamble like this, you know very well that you can fall flat on your face. And I think he was very well aware of the fact that this was still a gamble. So, I mean, he must have been so happy, you know. And that's what we were talking about earlier. I mean, I think that's the culmination of everything he worked towards, you know.
Because when you hear reports about the response actually in 1960 when the movie comes out, I mean, those moments don't come along very often. I mean, both the way the film was being talked about, but also inside cinemas. I mean, the fact that cinemas were, and during the shower scene in particular, cinemas were bedlam. That people, you know, the scream, because the scream that comes when, as an audience member, you're not expecting anything. Because now, I think now if you come to Psycho, you've probably heard of the shower scene. You probably know that, you know, you've seen this, and maybe you put two and two together, and you know where it's come from. You're seeing this movie in 1960. You don't know what's coming in this movie, and you've never seen anything like this before. So it becomes so that the atmosphere in a cinema. I mean, you know, many of us won't have experienced an atmosphere quite like that in a movie house, which is just people losing their minds, really.
Yeah, and if you think about, you know, how many times has this happened since? I mean, let's just go through that for a second here. Chestburster, right? You know, Jaws, you can probably argue, although I don't think the reaction was quite as strong. In a completely different way, obviously Star Wars, well, Empire Strikes Back, you know, the I'm your father moment. You know, not a, you know, freaking out sort of moment, but a profoundly changing, sort of generation altering moment. And, you know, one moment that I will always remember as being pretty special, quite frankly, is the final image of the Blair Witch Project. I remember being in this 2,000-seat theater in New York City, and that final shot, there was this sort of sigh of horror in the entire house that sort of gave you the chills, like something I've not really experienced since. It still doesn't have, I think, the impact of the shower scene, but that's, you can count those moments on one hand. I mean, I think that you're talking about these sort of once in a generation moments, and even then, I think you look at all these moments that we talked about, and there were others. Of course, The Exorcist was, certainly had an impact. But did anything affect culture, and cinema history and change all the rules the way that the shower scene did? I don't think anything quite to that extent.
I wanted to talk to you as well about Psycho's its influence specifically, because obviously people talk about it in terms of the horror movie and the slash movie, and it does have this huge impact there. But it has an impact on really, all the other filmmakers who we think of as being these kind of cinema-defining giants, Scorsese, Kubrick. It feels like everyone picked a trick up from Psycho. And you almost see this line. Something which comes out in the film is a direct line between Psycho and Raging Bull.
Yeah, no, I mean that the fact that Scorsese shot and edited the final fight with Jake LaMotta and basically in a way that mirrors the shower scene. I mean, it's so brilliant. Actually, it's a really bold move. But to have that sort of split screen comparison, which we have of course in Cine 52, I mean that was really fun to sort of piece together and look at. Look at what he did there. I mean, the influence is so profound, and then you think about all the the remakes of that scene, or the homages, or the tributes, or the parodies, the fan films. I mean, my gosh, I really enjoy going on YouTube every few months and see what kind of new shower scene shows up. And there's a great one with kittens that came out recently, and it's called Psycat.
Of course it is.
Of course,
Of course it is.
And it's totally fantastic, and I think it's going to continue. It's because now it's this, it is really. I mean, I think the shower scene is a cultural artifact. As Ileana Douglas told me. In an interview recently, she said it is like watching the Mona Lisa, in the sense that every time you watch it, you find something new. And I still find new things. I'm still just as fascinated and just as sort of borderline obsessed with that scene as I've ever been. And I'm definitely going to continue to work on it. There's so much more to uncover, because it really speaks. I think to the creative process. You can look at that scene in so many different ways, and because it's all these geniuses, Hitchcock, Tomasini, Saul Bass, Bernard Herrmann, sort of working together at this perfect time in history when people were ready for it, and because it's so layered. I can't even still wrap my head around all those layers of meanings that you can find in that shower scene, depending on which angle you want to look at it from. So it's all it is truly a piece that you can stare at for the rest of your life, and I guarantee you will never get to the bottom of it, because it is absolutely bottomless. It's amazing.